Very well, my name is Matty Reid. I'm not going to recap the previous couple of videos, but if you want to go back and look at them, then you can. I'm always short of time, and I always go over my time, like yesterday's episode. But it's one of the great questions that faces our time, and that what has God done about suffering and injustice? We've looked at a lot of different questions, but I want to wrap up by asking, what has God done about it? What has God done about it? Because often we cry out in suffering and injustice, God, where are you? You see it actually through the Bible as well. Lots of people who are supposedly men of God, who've been chosen by God, they ask the question, God, where are you in this suffering? Where are you in this injustice? Maybe that's a thought process that you have been through, but I want to tell you today that God is active, God is working in suffering and injustice right from the beginning. When man sold himself into a world of sin by disobeying God, he sold himself into a life of injustice and suffering. God has tried to buy us back, tried to buy back mankind from that world of suffering and injustice. God is active in it. In fact, the Bible tells us that God is still working in it. If you look at Romans 8 verse 28, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. So not only is God active in suffering and injustice, he is working that suffering and injustice for the good of those who love him. Genesis 50 verse 20, if you remember it from our weekend in March, Joseph says, although you meant it for evil, speaking to his brothers, God meant it for good. Although you meant this suffering, this injustice for evil, God meant it for good. He's still working in it. Jesus says to his disciples in the context of his death and resurrection, he knows they will weep and lament, whereas the world will rejoice. But he adds, you will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn to joy. Even though it will be difficult, disciples, your sorrow will turn to joy. I am active in this sorrow. I am active in this suffering. Jesus references sorrow all the time. It isn't something that he and God are unaware of, but they are still working in it. In fact, further on in the New Testament, in James says, count it all joy when you face trials of various kinds. He says, when you face trials, when life gets difficult because you're a Christian, count it joy. Try to redeem that. Try to buy back that suffering and injustice that you face for the glory of God. The Bible knows that everyone is going to face suffering and injustice at one point in their life. That's why Christ faced suffering and injustice as well. Let me read for you Acts chapter 8 verse 32 to 33. This is really key. It says, like a sheep, he, Jesus, was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he opens not his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. In his humiliation, justice was denied Jesus. So I'll ask you this, right? I'm going to ask you something here quickly. Imagine you were owed £1, by whoever it is. What would you do to get that £1 back? Pound's not really a big deal, to be honest. Certainly not for you who go to the Integrated and the Royal of Dungannon. Pound's not really that big a deal. Probably find £1 on the ground someday. Not that big a deal. Probably wouldn't do much about it. Say £100. Somebody owed you £100. What would you do to get that £100 back? Probably depends who it was. You'd maybe ask them for it nicely. You'd maybe ask them for it more aggressively. But I want to put to you, £100 million, £100 million, you, your children, your descendants for the rest of your lives would be perfectly sweet. £100 million. A company owes you that amount. They have wronged you. Maybe you've put a claim in against them. They have been asked to pay you £100 million in cash. It's very unlikely, but can you imagine it with me? What would you do for that? What would you do? Well, you've already taken them to court and they've been forced to pay it. Would you go to their office, find their CEO, find someone in charge and force them to pay it? You would do all you could for £100 million. There is no doubt. I try to think what I would do, and to be honest, maybe would be driven to violence. But imagine this. You have proof that they owe you that £100 million, but that company starts a smear campaign against you. It talks to your family, your friends, it talks to those who followed you, it talks to those who were friends with you, who knew you, and it starts to deface you, calling you a liar. It says that there's no way they owe you £100 million, that is pure fantasy. It goes and attacks you, attacks your character, says you're worthless, you are stupid, you are not right in the head. In fact, it goes as far to say that you're insane, and to be honest with you, you probably should be locked up. You should be locked up because of how crazy you are. Now, what sort of injustice is that? This company owes you £100 million, and they have just completely swerved that and instead attacked you viciously. How annoyed would you be? How much injustice is there? We've maybe gone a wee bit unrealistic there. I mean, how unimaginable is it that someone would owe you such a large amount, or that someone would be owed such a large amount and not given it? That there wouldn't be a public outcry because they weren't given it? Well, imagine if you were Christ. Christ was owed unimaginable worship. We owe Christ unimaginable worship, unimaginable riches. We owe him glory and praise for the rest of our lives, and yet constantly we fall short. Not only do we as Christians fall short, but the world has rejected him. The world owes him everything, and they reject him. What an injustice. Not only do they reject him, but when he came to earth to die for those same people who have rejected him, they did just that. They put him to death. They ignored what he said. They put lies to him. They put him in a court. They charged him as guilty, and he died. What injustice. What suffering. You know what? God carried out an injustice so that we, the unjust, those who do not give God what he is due, those who often ignore God and often reject God, God carried out an injustice so that in our unjust nature we can be made right and our unjust acts can be ignored. The bottom line is this. When we face injustice, when we face suffering, let us remind ourselves that God knows exactly how we feel. Henry reminded us that God offers us to give us rest. Josh reminded us that we should try and right the wrongs of this world. Peter Cooper reminded us that suffering and injustice came about because of what we have done. But I am reminded you that God sorted it all out. And one day, if you're a Christian, you will see that we will live in a world that has no more suffering and no more injustice because of what Christ has done. But until that day, let me remind you of the verse I said to you yesterday, Micah 6 verse 8. Until that day comes when we live in that perfect world, Micah 6 verse 8 says, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God.